Welcome to the second video in my overview of the Masterson Approach to diagnosing and treating personality disorders. In the previous video, we covered a few basic concepts. We looked at the concept of intrapsychic structure. We covered whole and split object relations. And then finally, we talked about how in the Masterson classification system, there are three distinct types of disordered intrapsychic structure. And those three types are the borderline, the narcissistic, and the schizoid disorders of the self. In this video, we're going to look at the specific, distinct ways that each of these three intrapsychic structures engage in splitting. And I think that this is perhaps the most important video of all in understanding how the Masterson Approach works, because it's not about the outward behavior. A lot of people on social media will tell you to look at the behavior of a person, and that will tell you, for example, if they're a narcissist. Nothing could be further from the truth. When we look at personality disorders, we don't want to look at the effect. We want to look at the cause, and the cause of the behavior that we're seeing in these people is the split intrapsychic structure. So without further ado, let's start with the borderline disorder of the self. And I'm going to start with this disorder because in my opinion, this is probably the easiest one to tackle first. In my opinion, it's the one that's the most straightforward, and it's the one that I think is the closest to the common understanding of splitting that I also discussed in the previous video. In the previous video, I discussed how most people think splitting is somebody thinking that you're all good or you're all bad. True splitting has to do with a particular area of the intrapsychic structure. So when we look at the borderline disorder, we see that there are two separate units. On the left, we have the rewarding or libidinal part unit, or RORU, which stands for Rewarding Object Relations Unit. And on the right, we have the withdrawing or aggressive part unit, or WORU, which stands for Withdrawing Object Relations Unit. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a really hard time wrapping my head around these fancy $5 words. And the acronyms RORU and WORU are a bit hard for me to pronounce. They're a bit of a tongue twister. So to simplify this, I like to just think clinging versus withdrawing. And so in basic terms, what that means is that the borderline person feels most regulated when they are clinging to the object in question. It's usually a person. When that borderline is feeling like they're rejected, or that object has withdrawn, or for whatever reason that borderline is sensing a real or imagined separation from the object, they are no longer in the good unit. They are now in the bad unit, and the bad unit is what makes them feel very dysregulated. And as we said in the previous video, they're going to do everything possible to get back here. They want to get to the good unit because the good unit is where they feel regulated. Now, I'm going to discipline myself and not get too nuanced because it's really, really important to just understand the basics. This Masterson approach can get really nuanced really quickly. But I do want to give you one example to help you understand that when we talk about borderline intrapsychic structure, we are not just talking about BPD. In the Masterson approach, all the PDs fall under these three categories. So one example would be obsessive compulsive personality disorder. OCPD in the Masterson approach has a borderline intrapsychic structure. And I had a lot of problems with this because when I think of somebody with OCPD, I think more narcissistic. But when you look at the intrapsychic structure, and the Masterson approach did not explain this. This is my own theorizing based on what I've learned. What is the object? What is the thing that the person with the OCPD is clinging to? Well, it's not a person. Somebody with OCPD is still desperately clinging to an object, but it's a non-human object. And so my guess would be that somebody with OCPD would feel most regulated when they're clinging to the rules, when they're clinging to the idea of perfection, when they're clinging to protocols and procedures, and when they are expected to deviate from that, when they are separated from the object, that's when they feel dysregulated. And so they need to get back to clinging to the object. Again, that is not necessarily something I read in Masterson. That's my understanding of how somebody with OCPD would fall under the borderline structure, because in Masterson, there's only 3 structures. But as I said, I don't want to get too crazy nuanced in this video. I am very tempted to go down all kinds of rabbit holes, but I want to just try to keep it simple in this video, and we will get more nuanced as we progress. But that's the borderline issue in a nutshell. Borderline structures, I need to cling to an object, and when I feel separated from that object, I don't like it, and I need to get back here. Next, we're going to talk about the narcissistic disorder of the self. And in my opinion, this is the most complex of the 3 disorders. So when we look at how the Masterson Approach diagrams the split in the narcissistic disorder of the self, what is actually split for a narcissistic person is their ego or their self-esteem. So on the left, you have the defensive fused part unit, and on the right, you have the aggressive fused part unit. And you can see that the diagram looks very different from borderline, because instead of 2 half circles, you have 2 complete circles that are linked. And so there's 2 things going on when it comes to the narcissistic person trying to regulate themselves. But before I explain what's happening, let's also simplify this diagram. And instead of thinking defensive fused part and aggressive fused part, let's just think superior versus inferior. So the first thing that I would unpack here is the idea that the narcissistic individual cannot regulate their self-esteem or their ego. They cannot see their self-worth as a whole, that sometimes I'm good at stuff and sometimes I'm bad at stuff. What a narcissistic person struggles with is the idea that people are superior to me or inferior to me. And the second part of this is why this is very complex. The second part of this is that the narcissistic person will link their self-esteem to the object. So they will start off in the good unit. In the good unit, now this is called the defensive unit, and I'm going to explain why that's called the defensive unit in just a minute. But in the good unit, they spot an object that they really admire, somebody that they think is spectacular, somebody that they say to themselves, wow, that person is amazing. Because they can't regulate their self-esteem, they need to attach their sense of ego to that good object. They link themselves to this person, and then what they expect is for that object to reflect to them that grandiose idea that, yes, you are wonderful and amazing. As long as a narcissistic person finds themselves in this unit, everything is good. They feel very regulated. They feel very calm. They feel very happy because the object is mirroring the grandiosity to them. The problem happens when that narcissistic person finds themselves in the bad unit. Now, either the object will do something wrong, or that narcissist will perceive that the object has done something wrong. And in basic terms, that sin is not reflecting the grandiosity. That person can take a very indifferent or neutral attitude toward the narcissistic individual. That person could point out a flaw or an imperfection in the narcissistic individual, and that's going to trickle down to them, and that's going to make them feel very, very upset. So they don't want to be in the bad unit. They're going to do whatever they can to get back to the good unit. And as we discussed, any personality disorder can invert the pole. Narcissist is probably my favorite illustration of this, even though all of them can invert poles. My favorite illustration is that the narcissist will do this. So instead of you're on top making me feel inferior, I'm going to flip this around. I'm going to make you feel inferior, or I'm going to try. And if that doesn't work, then I'll just get rid of you and we'll start over with a brand new person. Again, this is not the only way that a narcissistic person will function. I just want to keep it very simple so you can understand the difference between where a narcissistic person is splitting and where a borderline person is splitting. They are not splitting the same way. Now, before I move on, I do want to explain why the good unit is referred to as the defensive unit and the bad unit is referred to as the aggressive unit. We're going to start with the bad unit. So when that narcissistic person is faced with reality, in other words, when that narcissistic person is forced to confront their imperfections or their flaws, this is seen as aggression to them. They view that as an attack. And because they're not able to regulate this, the defense against imperfection, the defense against this reality is grandiosity. Sometimes they'll find themselves over here because somebody is legit causing them to feel a certain way. But sometimes the object isn't doing anything. Sometimes the object does something completely innocuous, but because that person with the disorder can't regulate that, they have no choice but to interpret that completely innocuous comment as aggression or, oh, you're attacking me. And so this is why we might see them invert the pole or just do whatever is necessary to get back to the good unit where they feel regulated. Finally, we come to the schizoid disorder of the self. And the schizoid disorder is split into two units as well. On the left, you have the master-slave part unit. And on the right, you have the sadistic object, self-in-exile part unit. Now, to simplify this, I like to look at this as slavery versus alienation. And so one thing you may have noticed when I reproduced these diagrams that I read about in the Masterson literature onto these slides, I chose to color them black and white, partially to symbolize the very black and white nature of splitting, but also to symbolize that for narcissistic and borderline disorder of the self, there is a good option. And narcissistic and borderline disorders, they always have the hope of getting back to the good unit. When things are bad, it's okay. I'll just find myself back over here. And once I get here, I'm going to park it and I'm going to try my best to just stay here. You'll notice that my schizoid diagram, instead of black and white, I've chosen black and bleak because neither one of these units is a good option. And I like to joke that while narcissistic and borderline people have a good and a bad unit, schizoid people have a choice between this sucks and this blows. Either one of these options is not ideal. Borderline and narcissists have an ideal that they can aspire to, but schizoids do not. And so one of the ways that schizoid people might try to regulate themselves is by constantly moving back and forth between these two units. This is called the Schizoid Dilemma. If I stay in a relationship too long, I might feel misunderstood. I might feel exploited or taken advantage of. I might feel intruded upon and suffocated. And so what I might do is get away from this person and choose isolation. Now I am free to exist. I'm free to express the full spectrum of my identity without feeling like I have to suppress myself. I don't feel intruded upon. But you know what? After a while, this gets pretty meaningless. I'm not going to say lonely, because schizoid people have an incredible ability to enjoy their alone time. But after a while, this doesn't really turn into loneliness. It turns into existential dread, because you're just existing. And so when this gets old, we're going to move back over here, and the cycle keeps going back and forth, because there is no ideal for us to aspire to. But schizoid people have another method of attempting to regulate themselves, and this is known as the Schizoid Compromise. Now, in the Masterson literature, there is no diagram. So I created my own diagram for this. And instead of black and bleak, I have kind of like gray and bleak. And the Schizoid Compromise is basically an attempt to try to integrate these two poles, to try to have the best of these both worlds, usually by having one foot in one unit and one foot in another. So this could look like being in relationships, but not committing all the way, or having tons and tons of acquaintances, but no real actual close friends. So I'm not totally isolated, but I'm not super close to anybody at the same time. So this is kind of how a schizoid person will try to regulate themselves. As I said, this can get incredibly nuanced for all three of them, and you might have some questions because there are some aspects of all three of these disorders where they may look similar to the other two. We will cover some of these nuances in future videos, but for now, it's just important to understand where each of these three intrapsychic structures are split. As a schizoid person, I don't have the same impairment as a narcissistic person. I don't have the same impairment as a borderline individual. So when I look at borderline people or narcissistic people, at least I'll just speak for myself. My whole life, I've thought to myself, well, gee, I'm pretty healthy because I know I don't act like that. It wasn't until I uncovered the Masterson Approach and I saw how schizoid people are dysregulated. That's when I realized, ooh, wait a second. I do have a problem with splitting, but it is not with emotional regulation. It's not with my ego regulation. My therapist actually used the term interpersonal dysregulation. And so I have a hard time regulating closeness. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's a lot more to be said about schizoid PD, as well as the other intrapsychic structures, as well as the other personality disorders that fall under each of these intrapsychic structures. So I hope this has been helpful to you. In the next video, we're going to build off of this concept. And as soon as I'm finished with the complete overview of the Masterson Approach, I'm going to start getting into some of these nuanced differences so we can really look at some of these disorders with a fine-tooth comb. I'm Jen Guerriero, and this is Poisonous People. Thanks for watching.